Every dog in the yard leaves its kennel for the fence the moment the old man in the mud-colored coat steps near it, and no one on staff can say why. "He's going to spook every one of them back there," said the volunteer at the intake window, a college girl named Marisol, who had been folding towels for the laundry bin when she looked up and stopped. She said it to the woman beside her, not to him, the way people talk about weather or traffic, something happening to them rather than by them. Somebody should get him away from that fence before evaluation day gets any worse than it already is. The other volunteer, older, with a clipboard she never seemed to write on, didn't answer right away. She was watching the yard. 5 kennel runs down the east side, and in every one of them, a dog that had spent the morning refusing its breakfast, pacing tight ovals, flattening its ears at anyone in a shelter polo, was now standing at the chain link nearest the old man, tails low and still, eyes fixed on him with an attention that looked almost like relief. Not one of them barked. Not one of them so much as scratched the fence. "He's not doing anything," the older volunteer said. "Look at his hands. He hasn't moved his hands." He hadn't. He stood with his weight settled back on his heels. One shoulder held a half-inch higher than the other in a way that looked less like injury and more like habit worn into the bone, and he was simply present at the fence the way a fence post is present. And the dogs came to him anyway, one after another, the way water finds the low place in a field without being told to. If you have ever been the one everyone looked past right up until the moment they needed exactly what you knew, you already understand the man in the barn coat. His grandson tugged twice at his sleeve before he got an answer. Weston Hackney was 12, all elbows and a haircut he'd chosen himself, and he had a clear preference already forming for the black and tan hound 2 runs down, who kept sitting and then flopping over sideways, as if the effort of sitting had exhausted him. "Grandpa, which one do you want?" Lloyd Hackney didn't turn his head so much as turn his whole body, a slow quarter pivot that brought his right side around to face the boy, and for a moment he looked at the yard rather than any single dog in it, the way a man reads a field before he decides where to walk. 5 dogs at the fence. 2 others still working their way over from farther runs, unhurried, certain. "Don't know yet," he said. "They'll tell us." Marisol, at the window, had gone quiet, her towel forgotten in her lap. She didn't know what she was looking at. She only knew that in 4 months on this job, she had never once seen the yard go still like that, all at once, for anyone. The drive over had been Weston's idea, hatched 3 days after their barn cat, Tibbs, had finally died of nothing more dramatic than 17 years, curled in a patch of sun on the porch boards where he'd curled every clear afternoon of Weston's whole remembered life. Ruth had cried more than the boy had, which surprised no one, and it was Weston, red-eyed but practical in the particular way of children who have just learned that death comes gently sometimes, who suggested the shelter instead of a store, and Lloyd who had agreed without needing to be convinced. He had ridden the whole way with his right hand resting on the truck's console and his left arm held close to his body, the way he held it most days now, ever since a shoulder injury older than his grandson had settled into a permanent ceiling somewhere around collarbone height. He did not reach across himself for anything. He turned instead, for the coffee cup in the holder, for the window crank, for his grandson's seatbelt buckle when the boy fumbled it. A small, deliberate rotation of his whole trunk that had become so practiced it barely registered as effort anymore, just the shape of how Lloyd Hackney moved through a day. In the left pocket of his barn coat, worn soft and the color of creek mud at both elbows, rode a coiled length of leather no thicker than a finger, its stitching run in a tight, doubled pattern he'd learned from a farrier before he'd ever worn a uniform, the brass hardware at its end long faded past shine into a dull, greenish patina. He had carried it in that pocket, or one like it in whatever coat he happened to be wearing, for 31 years. No dog had worn it in all that time. He did not explain this to anyone, and no one in 31 years had asked him to. Estelle would have asked. She'd have looked at that lead the way she looked at most things he didn't offer up on his own, patient and unhurried, waiting for him to get around to it in his own time. And 11 years gone now, she still occupied that particular silence in him, the way a missing tooth occupies a tongue. Not painful exactly, just there, a shape he kept returning to out of habit rather than hurt. In the lobby, Weston pressed his face near the glass of the kennel photographs pinned along the wall, calling out names as if reciting a roster. Lloyd stood by the door with his coat still buttoned, and when the woman at the front desk asked if they were here about a specific animal, he said no, they were here to look, and something in the plainness of it made her glance at him twice before she buzzed them through toward the yard. Jared Radcliffe was already 40 minutes into what would turn out to be the hardest intake of his week, and he was good at it. That mattered, whatever came after. A stray had come in overnight, a shepherd mix with a torn ear, and a stranger's fear baked so deep into him that he'd put a kennel attendant's forearm in his teeth within the first 10 minutes. Not hard, not through skin, but enough to end the conversation for everybody in the room. Jared had cleared the kennel of onlookers himself, dropped to a crouch at an angle the dog could read as harmless, and spent 11 straight minutes doing nothing but breathing audibly and looking somewhere just past the dog's shoulder instead of at his eyes. He talked the whole time in a voice so level it barely rose and fell, narrating nothing in particular, the weather, the smell of the disinfectant, anything with no weight to it, until the dog's hackles came down and his tail found the floor, and eventually his nose found Jared's knuckles. "Score him a 4 on the reactivity scale, not a 6, Jared told Kellen Tillman afterward, tapping the laminated card clipped inside his shirt pocket, the one with the county's rubric printed small on both sides, columns for bite history, resource guarding, recovery time, a dozen boxes that turned a living animal into a number a computer somewhere could sort. Fear-based, not aggression-based. Per the rubric, that's the difference between an adoption track and a euthanasia flag, so we get it right the first time. Kellen wrote it down. He was 24, 2 years into the job, and he had learned in that time that Jared Radcliffe's read on a dog was almost always the correct one, which was why what happened next stuck with him longer than it should have. Jared straightened, rolled the stiffness out of his neck, and glanced through the window toward the yard, and stopped. Who let a stranger walk right up to the working dog runs? Kellen followed his gaze. The old man in the barn coat, a boy beside him. 5 dogs already drifting to the fence like the yard had tilted toward him. Grandfather and grandson, Kellen said. Came in for an adoption look. Front desk cleared them same as anybody. On evaluation day. Jared said it to Kellen, not to the yard, not to the man himself. The verdict passed sideways the way verdicts about people often are, decided in a room they aren't standing in. Every one of those dogs is supposed to be settled and readable for the county assessor by 2 o'clock, and instead, I've got a confused old fella wandering the fence line stirring them up for no reason anybody can name. Go walk him back toward the lobby before this whole afternoon's readings are garbage, he said, confused the way he'd say overcast, a fact requiring no further evidence, and went back to his clipboard, already 3 tasks ahead in his head, already certain he'd solved a small problem before it became a large one. Kellen didn't move right away. He was looking at the yard too now, and something about the shape of what he was seeing didn't match the shape of what Jared had just said. Kellen found Lloyd at the fence a few minutes later and asked, as gently as he knew how, whether he had some identification on him and a particular reason for being this close to the working dog wing, since that section wasn't technically open to general visitors on assessment days. Lloyd produced a driver's license without comment, held it out with his right hand, and said nothing else, watching the dogs rather than the young man reading his birth date. A volunteer drifted over next, the one with the clipboard she never wrote on, and suggested, kindly enough, that he might be more comfortable waiting in the lobby with a cup of coffee while his grandson looked around, on account of how busy and loud the yard could get for folks not used to it. Lloyd told her without heat that the coffee in the lobby had been sitting since morning and would do him no favors, and that he was comfortable exactly where he stood. She laughed before she caught herself, unsure if it had been a joke. A second staffer, passing with a mop bucket, called back over his shoulder to no one in particular that maybe somebody ought to phone the family and come collect him before he got himself lost in the parking lot, and grinned like it was harmless, the kind of joke thrown out to fill a silence rather than to wound anyone in particular. Lloyd let that one sit a moment before he answered it, and when he did, he wasn't looking at the man with the mop. He was looking at the hound Weston had taken a liking to, 2 runs down, who had just stopped mid-stride and gone rigid, weight shifted hard onto her front legs. That one's not stretching, Lloyd said. She's bracing. Somebody's about to walk a cart past her blind side. Kellen frowned, followed the line of Lloyd's gaze, and saw the feed cart coming around the corner of the building exactly where Lloyd had said, the wheel squeaking the way it always squeaked, the hound's whole body already coiled 2 full seconds before the cart came into her field of view. She didn't bolt. She didn't bark. She simply flattened until the cart passed, then rose again. And it was so precisely what Lloyd had described, and so entirely unremarkable to everyone who hadn't been watching for it, that Kellen felt something small and cold move through him that had nothing to do with the weather. Farther down the row, in the kennel marked with a red incident tag, the dog named Marsh had stopped lying in the back corner where he'd spent most of the last several weeks, unmoving through meals, unmoving through cleaning, unmoving through anything short of a fire alarm. He was on his feet now, pacing a tight diagonal from the back wall to the gate and back again, throat working with a low, rising sound that wasn't quite a bark and wasn't quite a whine, aimed at the fence. Aimed, Kellen realized with a slow crawl of attention up the back of his neck at the old man in the mud-colored coat. He hadn't made a sound like that in the 6 weeks Kellen had worked this row. By early afternoon, the yard had stopped pretending to settle. 2 more dogs had drifted to the fence nearest Lloyd until 7 runs held animals facing one direction instead of pacing their walls, and the county assessor was due within the hour to score temperaments that had, by every account on the clipboard, gone from unreadable to unreadable in an entirely new way. Jared stood at the gate with his arms crossed, the laminated card forgotten in his pocket, watching a scene his rubric had no column for. "Fine," he said, finally, to Kellen rather than to Lloyd, the concession costing him something in his voice even as he made it. "If he's the reason they're wound up, maybe he's the reason they'll settle. Ask him," Kellen asked. Lloyd didn't need it explained twice. He stepped to the fence, closer now than he'd stood all afternoon, and lifted his right hand, only the right, the left staying where it always stayed, tucked close, and curled 2 fingers under against his palm in a shape that looked almost accidental. An old man idly making a loose fist. He gave one sound, low in his chest, not a word, not a whistle. A single flat tone held for less than 2 seconds. Every dog at the fence dropped into a sit at once. Not scattered, not staggered. At once, 5 haunches meeting pavement in the same half-second, Marsh included, the pacing dog going still mid-stride, as though a hand had reached out and settled on his back. The 2 dogs, still working their way across the yard, broke into a trot and sat as well, folding down at the fence line like a held breath finally let go. The yard went silent in a way it had not been silent all day. Even the wind seemed to drop. Weston's mouth was open. Kellen had stopped breathing without noticing. And Jared Radcliffe stood at the gate with his arms still crossed, looking at 7 working dogs from 3 different postings, and God knew how many years apart, all watching the same old man with the same unblinking attention, and understood, with the particular vertigo of a man whose rubric has just failed to predict the only thing that mattered, that he did not know what he was looking at. No one spoke for a long moment. Lloyd lowered his hand. "Who is he?" Jared finally said, to Kellen, to the yard, to no one who could yet answer him. The silence that followed the sit held the whole yard the way ice holds a pond, and it was Jared who broke it, walking the fence line to the gate marked with Marsh's kennel number, pulling the clipboard from its hook with the particular briskness of a man trying to outmotion his own unease. The file was thin. A vet intake sheet, a temperament score sheet, and near the back, a single incident report. 4 years old. Flagging the dog, unadoptable aggressive on the strength of 1 line. Subject lunged and made contact with handler during transport. No further explanation offered. No name attached beyond a case number. The rubric did the rest on its own. Unadoptable aggressive dogs, per the county contract, held for a mandated window and then euthanized if no waiver was filed. The waiver window on Marsh's file had closed 11 days ago. The date now scheduled, stamped in the corner in a font too small for its consequence, was 9 days out. "He's on the list," Jared said, more to himself than to Kellen, running a thumb down the page as if pressure might change the print. "I didn't even know he was flagged that heavy. I inherited this file with 40 others when I started." Kellen, trying to be useful the way 24-year-olds try to be useful, said he'd pull the full incident record so they'd at least know what they were dealing with before the assessor arrived, and went to the terminal in the back office to do it. The search returned nothing. Not redacted, not missing, sealed, flagged under a data migration hold from a records contractor the county had used years back, the kind of clerical wall that exists to keep old liability from surfacing rather than to protect anyone living. Kellen tried a supervisor override out of simple stubbornness, and the system logged the attempt, which was worse than doing nothing at all, because it pinged straight into the shelter's compliance folder under Jared's name, the same folder that fed the quarterly numbers the county reviewed before renewing anyone's contract. Jared read the alert over Kellen's shoulder and went very quiet in a way that had nothing to do with the dogs outside. "There's an audit coming," he said, low enough that Kellen had to lean in to catch it. "Next week. I wasn't supposed to know yet. A friend on the board mentioned it in passing. They're reviewing clearance rates across all 3 county shelters before the East Kennel building goes to auction. Faster clearances make the numbers look healthier going into a sale. I didn't ask what that meant. I just kept clearing the list they gave me." He looked at the sealed flag on the screen, then out the window at the yard, at Marsh, still sitting where Lloyd had put him, patient as stone. "If I go digging in a sealed record 8 days before an audit, on a dog I'm supposed to be scheduling out, that's not curiosity. That's a liability question with my name on it." He did not say it as an excuse. He said it the way a man says a thing he has just now, for the first time, heard out loud in his own voice, and does not much like the sound of. Kira Prescott arrived a little after 4, having been reached by a phone call from Kellen that he made without asking anyone's permission, because he had worked with her once during a joint training exercise years before he'd taken this job and had kept her number the way you keep a good tool you rarely need. She came in Army straight, even in civilian clothes, 41 years old and carrying the particular economy of movement of someone who has spent a career walking into rooms that don't want her there and getting the room to want her there anyway. She found Lloyd at the fence and stopped 3 full steps short of him and said his old call sign, the training tone's name from a joint exercise 22 years gone, and nothing else, waiting to be told she had it wrong. He didn't correct her. "I oversee 2 of the 3 county contracts," she said finally, when the moment had run its course and the yard's silence had made clear it wasn't going to be filled for her. "Cut Bank isn't one of them. Whatever pull I've got doesn't reach this building's paperwork. I can vouch for the man. I can't override the file." She looked at Marsh, at the red tag on his kennel, and something crossed her face that looked like the specific frustration of a debt she couldn't pay from where she was standing. Jared, listening from the gate, said the only thing left to ask, "Then who can?" Lloyd was quiet long enough that Weston reached over and took hold of 2 fingers of his grandfather's right hand, not tugging this time, just holding on. "The incident on that dog's sealed report," Lloyd said, "happened under my command, not to me. To a boy I was training, 20-some years younger than I am now, who froze under a transport threat and let the leash go, and the dog did what dogs do when a line goes slack in a bad moment. He moved to cover the gap himself. Nobody's hand got bit that wasn't already reaching for a dog that had no handler holding him." He let that settle before he went on, his voice never rising, never dropping into anything that asked for sympathy. "I wrote the report that made it the dog's fault. That boy had a wife and a baby coming and a career that ends the day his name's on a failure like that. The dog had nobody but me, so I signed it his. He had signed another man's failure as his own, so a family could keep a father, and never once told the dog it wasn't his fault either." "That report's mine," Lloyd said. "Not his, not Marsh's. You're the only one standing in this yard today with the standing to say so on paper. Kira can't. I can't. I'm not on your books. I never was. It has to be you." Jared stood with the thin file still in his hand, and for the first time all day he did not reach for the laminated card in his pocket. He read the sealed report in full an hour later, once Kellen had walked him through the override process step by step and stood beside him while the compliance flag blinked its patient, indifferent yellow on the screen. It took 11 minutes to read 4 pages, and Jared read them twice, the second time slower than the first, his thumb resting against the corner of the desk the way a man's hand rests against something solid when the rest of him needs steadying. The report was old-fashioned in its plainness, no hedging, no passive voice hiding a decision. Lloyd had written it the way he said things at the fence, small true sentences stacked one on another. A transport under stress. A young handler's hands failing him at the one moment hands aren't allowed to fail. A dog closing a gap a leash should have closed. And at the bottom, in Lloyd's own hand, a line that took responsibility for a moment Lloyd himself hadn't been holding. Jared sat with it a long moment, the office quiet except for the hum of the terminal, and when he finally spoke, it wasn't to Kellen, and it wasn't to the room. It was the sound of a man revising something in himself out loud. "I built 4 years of clearances on files I never once thought to question," he said. "Not because I didn't care, because the rubric told me I didn't have to look past the flag. I kept telling myself the data was solid ground. Turns out solid ground was just where nobody happened to be standing yet." He pulled Marsh's folder, uncapped a pen, and wrote the amendment himself, rather than routing it through anyone who might soften it into something smaller. Incident report found to misattribute cause. Euthanasia flag rescinded. Animal cleared for adoption pending handler review. He signed it, dated it, and did not once glance toward the county's auction calendar pinned above his desk while he did. Lloyd, told of it at the fence a few minutes later, received the news the way he received most things, with a short nod and no visible relief. Though something in the set of his good shoulder eased by a fraction, Kellen would not have caught if he hadn't spent the whole day learning to watch for exactly that kind of thing. "There's one thing," Lloyd said when Jared came out to tell him himself. "That boy's name goes back on the record next to mine. Not instead of mine, next to it. He didn't do anything a scared kid with a war going on around him hasn't done. He doesn't get to disappear from his own dog's history just because I was the one who could afford to carry it." Jared said it would be done, and meant it, and went back inside to do it before the workday closed. Weston stood at the fence beside his grandfather, while Marsh, freed from his kennel for the first time in weeks, pressed his whole weight against the chain link nearest Lloyd's hand, and the boy finally reached over, without being asked, and touched the coiled shape riding in the barn coat's pocket. "Is this for him?" "Might be," Lloyd said. "Wasn't sure who it was for till today." The county's East Kennel building went to auction 9 days later, exactly as scheduled, and the retired K-9 program that operated out of its back half did not go with it, carved out as a protected line item at Kira Prescott's insistence and Jared Radcliffe's written recommendation, the two of them arguing the county board into a decision neither could have won alone. Jared rewrote the shelter's intake procedure that same week, adding a single clause that hadn't existed before. No working or retired military dog could be flagged for euthanasia without review by a living handler familiar with its service record, if one could be found and reached. He kept the laminated scoring card in his pocket. He simply stopped reaching for it first. He told Kellen once, weeks later, that the hardest part hadn't been amending the file. It had been realizing how many other files he'd never once thought to ask a living person about. Somewhere, a record is still waiting on someone patient enough to read it all the way through. Spring came to Willow Ford the way it always did, unhurried, the river running high, and the fence posts along Ruth's side yard gone soft with new grass at their base. Lloyd knelt by the gate the way he knelt every year about this time, resetting a hinge that worked itself loose every winter, no matter how many times he'd tightened it the spring before, turning his whole body rather than reaching across himself for the second bolt. Ruth brought coffee out around mid-morning without being asked, same as every year, and sat on the step to drink hers while he worked. Marsh lay across Lloyd's boots on the porch a few feet off, one ear twitching now and then at some sound too far off to matter. Otherwise still, the particular stillness of a dog who has stopped listening for the sound of a gate closing behind him for good. On the porch rail above them, coiled loose where Lloyd had set it down that morning out of habit rather than need, lay the leather lead, its false 9-cord stitching worn smooth under 31 years of a hand's idle turning, the brass hardware faded green and patient. It held its coil the way it always had, needing no dog on the other end of it to remember its shape, and for the first time in 3 decades, it was not waiting for anything at all.